Spencer Critchley is a Democratic strategist. He's the author of a book called Patriots of Two Nations: Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next. Thank you so much for joining us on LBC, Spencer Critchley. What happens next? I love that. What happens next?
Pleasure, Rachel. Well, what happens next, as I was predicting in the book, I roughly got right, is what's happening to us right now, except that I looked ahead and saw what's happening now as the worst conceivable outcome in a country like the United States. I actually thought it was quite unlikely it would be this bad. And, I was saying this is where this points if it's followed to its extreme. But Trump is following it to the extreme. We must not downplay the seriousness of what's happening right now in the United States. He's not behaving in ways that are somewhat like an authoritarian. He is an authoritarian, doing absolutely everything he can to dismantle our democracy and replace it with an autocracy. We keep passing one milestone after another, one red flag after another gets knocked down. Just in the last day or two, with the indictment of the former head of the FBI based on no evidence, just because Trump sees him as a political enemy, in itself is a grave crisis in American democracy, and it's only one of a long list of such moves.
And of course, we haven't had time because I wanted to get to you to talk about the crisis in free speech across America, the land of the free, what happened with Jimmy Kimmel, who's now being reinstated, the two lawsuits against the New York Times and one against the Wall Street Journal, completely without foundation. Of course, the one against the Wall Street Journal, as we've seen from the publication of that birthday book. I mean, Wall Street Journal has complete justification in having published the story about the birthday card to Epstein. But anyway, let's not get into the weeds of it. But what the key question is really, for those of us looking on with horror at what is happening as America turns itself into an autocracy, is what happened to the supposed checks and balances, to the Constitution, to the Supreme Court justices, who are supposed to be standing in the way of this very process.
Yes, and this really is, in my opinion, the genius of the original design of the country, and I'm certainly not alone in that opinion, that the founders, understanding the deep flaws in human nature, designed this system of checks and balances. As James Madison, one of the principal authors of the Constitution, said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So they knew there would always be a risk of a dictator seizing power or of government collapsing into just an enterprise of pure corruption. And so they designed these three branches of government to check each other, to pit the interests of the different branches of government against each other in the service of a minimum level of integrity and ultimately the survival of democracy. What they could not have foreseen, and I think that almost nobody foresaw, was what would happen if a leader came along who not only was a demagogue, who they certainly predicted, they warned explicitly of the risks of a man of low character, but practiced in the arts of manipulating crowds, but one who utterly lacked shame, so that public humiliation and scorn and ostracism meant nothing to him. And that is Trump. He's almost like a force of nature that way. And the other thing I don't think they could anticipate was that the sense of shame based on some kind of sense of honor that people at least would want to pretend to would be a backstop across society, especially at the upper levels of society. But instead, what we're seeing is that even the most powerful people in the United States are just crumbling like scared little children, and not in the face of a threat of violence, but really in the face of a threat of inconvenience or perhaps a slight reduction in their profit margin.
Yeah, I mean, most of the threats that he is making are commercial. I will take you down for 10 billion. I will sue you to kingdom come. He loves suing, and he sees evidence that if he bullies and threatens, almost everybody has caved. I mean, I can think of Rupert Murdoch hasn't caved. I mean, he is the owner of News Corp that owns the Wall Street Journal. Has Mike Bloomberg? I mean, who owns Bloomberg? Bloomberg hasn't caved. They
Right.
published they published the cache of Epstein emails, but we saw Disney caving in the face of pressure from the regulator over a deal. But what about the Supreme Court that's supposed to uphold the Constitution? What's happened there?
Boy, there's so much to address here.
I know, I know.
The Supreme Court, has largely been taken over by people who actually ideologically believe in this theory of the unitary executive, which does want a nearly monarchical president. So, as destructive as I believe that view is, you could at least argue that some of them hold it honestly, so to speak. It's not just a case of people being cowards or corrupt, although I think there has to be a giant asterisk next to Justice Thomas in terms of the
Yeah,
indications
that
of corruption.
yeah.
That in itself is a huge subject, that the United States has this significant of people now, cohort of people on the right now who really do not believe in liberal democracy, the foundation of the country. They actually think it's essentially a mistake, and we do need to have an authoritarian country under the authority ultimately of a certain version of the Christian God. In a way, they're Christian jihadists, and they don't have that much of a difference with the Taliban, for example, except that they would see the Taliban as competition in the sort of religious fundamentalist extremism department. So that's one part of this. But I think that the widespread public corruption, the corruption of character, is another key element here. Trump himself, of course, is just corrupt down to his toes. I don't think he can imagine that there are people in the world who are not just fundamentally corrupt. But across the country, one of the cultural developments that helped prepare the way for this was a switch to a system of morality, particularly among people at the top of society, but it's really become pervasive, in which the market justifies everything. I think the British science fiction author actually came up with a good term for this, Ian Banks, marketolatry, where you, in effect, it's idolatry, but the market replaces, the graven images that would be the idols in this religion. And there are many people now in the United States who will seriously argue that basically, if it sells, it's by definition legitimate. Or if, a majority of the people will vote for it, then it's by definition moral. And there is no other consideration. And you'll hear Trump himself talking about this, how, how could these people be wrong? A majority of people voted for this, therefore it's right. Or his obsessive focus on ratings as the measure of everything. And of course, the obsessive focus on money and profits as the measure of everything. Now, lots of people would like to say, well, that's capitalism for you. But in fact, capitalism has often functioned with a strong moral component. And it seems quaint now, but in bygone ages, even the most rapacious capitalists could be shamed if they're exposed as behaving in an immoral fashion.
Like, if we look at Robert Maxwell, cool, who jumped off a boat or was killed by Mossad. I mean, anyway.
Yeah.
Going back to what you were saying about the Christian jihadis and their ruler, or their kind of the messiah for them being Donald Trump, is interesting because he's purely transactional, irreligious, and mercantile. And yet all those guys are, like Charlie Kirk, were promulgating a fundamentalist message essentially around very conservative religious principles. How come those two very different forces have met to combine into something so ineluctable? Who's useful idiot here? Trump,
That's a very good question.
or the Christian jihadis?
That's a very good question. You can make the case in both directions. Devout Christians, sincerely devout religious people, whether they're Christians or Muslims or any other faith, are also wonderful targets for con artists. And con artists have always known this. This is why so many con artists in the United States,
Billy
for
Graham.
example, are like, well, Billy Graham's respectable compared to many of them.
Okay.
But Jerry
But they get very
Falwell, for
rich on the
example,
back of the gullibility.
no,
Yeah.
exactly. And Jerry Falwell, for example, or Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, there's a very long list of these sort of tent show revivalists and snake oil salespeople. And you will notice how many of these people are constantly selling products. and it's all about money. And then they turn the gospel into the prosperity gospel. So they promise to make you rich if they follow, their
Oh, I
version of the
see.
teachings
This
of
is
Jesus.
brilliant. Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah.
it
I'm
is.
getting it.
So, everybody who understands how cons work, also how cults work, exploitive cults, and in my own background, I've done in the past some investigative reporting on cults and learned a lot about how they function. And they look for people who are vulnerable for various reasons, like drug addicts or students in college who are worried about the exams coming up, or people who are deeply religious who have proven they're willing to believe things that cannot be proven with evidence. They believe things where they have no evidence for it. This is not to dismiss those beliefs, but it is a signal to people who want to exploit them. Now, on the other hand, a lot of these Christian nationalists and Christian fundamentalist leaders in general recognize that Trump is, to one degree or another, they can recognize that he's a truly horrible person. I mean, he's not just immoral. Morality is absent from this person. It's kind of terrifying.
Okay, but we
But
must
they
wrap it
think they're
up here.
using
But
him. They think they're using
so
him in
vote
a
Trump and
righteous
you can
cause.
get vote Trump and you can be good and rich. I mean, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Spencer. I wish we had longer. I could
Me too.
talk to you for the rest of the hour.